finding a neighborhood pharmacist is becoming increasingly challenging. Over the past 2 years, the nation's 3 biggest pharmacy chains with brick-and-mortar stores.
Special correspondent Fred DeSam Lazaro reports many small or independent pharmacies complain that those high prices, in many cases, actually hurt them.
A new study finds about 1 in 3 pharmacies have closed in the United States since 2010. From mom-and-pop independents to big chain drugstores, this trend has a serious impact on healthcare across the country.
It begins quietly, almost unnoticed. A refill that should have been simple suddenly isn't available, or the price tag climbs high enough to sting. Behind that small moment of the pharmacy counter lies something much larger, a storm that started with trade disputes between Washington and New Delhi and has now reached directly into medicine cabinets across America. What began as a debate over tariffs has become a battle over access to life-saving drugs, leaving families to wonder how long supplies will last and what happens when the next prescription can't be filled in August 2025. A single announcement from Washington set off a chain reaction no one saw coming. The Trump administration declared a 50% tariff on Indian imports, framing it as a bold move to rebuild American industry. The headlines focus on factories and blue-collar jobs. But buried deep in the fine print was something that would hit far closer to home: pharmaceuticals. The very drugs millions of Americans depend on were suddenly pulled into a political fight. The impact wouldn't show up in trade reports or manufacturing data, but in empty pharmacy shelves and rising prices that ordinary people couldn't afford. India's reaction was measured, almost silent. There were no fiery speeches or public threats. Instead, production slowed, export timelines stretched. Routes were redirected toward other regions. There was no official ban, no overt retaliation, but the effects were just as powerful. Each quiet delay chipped away at the steady flow of medicine into the United States, and before long, the disruption began to reach ordinary households. Few Americans realized just how deep a dependence on India ran. More than 40% of the nation's generic drugs come from Indian factories, an enormous share of the medications people take every day. These aren't exotic or specialized treatments. They are the everyday essentials: antibiotics for infections, insulin for diabetics, blood pressure pills, and cancer drugs that buy patients precious time. For years, India's low-cost production, often 60 to 70% cheaper than U.S. manufacturing, kept the American healthcare system afloat. But when that stream faltered, the fragility of the system was suddenly exposed on At first. It looked like minor inconvenience. A refill delayed, a back order that lasted a few days, pharmacists posting short notices about supply disruptions. Yet those small ripples turned to waves almost overnight. Within weeks, cities across the country were facing critical shortages. Ordinary families began rationing their medicine. Parents split pills in half to stretch a prescription. Some patients stopped taking their drug entirely as prices soared in Texas. One man walked into his pharmacy to find that the cost of his heart medication had jumped from $28 to $91 in a single month. There was no explanation beyond a printed note about supply issues. He had no warning, no assistance, no alternative, only an impossible choice between paying rent or paying to stay alive. His story echoed across the country. Diabetics scrambled to find insulin. Cancer patients waited weeks to begin chemotherapy. The security people once felt about their prescriptions evaporated almost overnight. This wasn't a passing glitch. It was the unraveling of a lifeline. When nearly half of America's generic drug supply falters, the consequences don't land on corporate executives or policymakers. They fall on families at kitchen tables. They are the ones cutting pills in half, pushing off utility bills, or hoping a child's fever breaks without antibiotics. They had no say in the trade wars or tariff announcements, yet they were the ones paying the price. Meanwhile, India quietly reshaped its role on the global stage. Pharmaceutical exports that once flowed steadily to the United States were redirected toward Africa, Latin America, and Europe. For decades, Washington had encouraged India's rise as a pharmacy of the world, a reliable supply of affordable medicine that made U.S. healthcare somewhat sustainable. Now that relationship was shifting. New partners were stepping in to fill the void America had created through its own policies. In Washington, the realization hit hard. What had once been a cornerstone of affordable healthcare had turned into a national vulnerability. Inside the White House, urgency replaced confidence. Emergency meetings brought together officials from the FDA, the Department of Health, and national security agencies. Ideas were thrown around in every direction, tapping into federal medical stockpiles, fast-tracking domestic drug production, importing through intermediary nations to bypass tariffs. But each solution faced the same obstacle: time. Drug manufacturing and supply chains don't adapt overnight, and while policymakers debated, shelves continued to empty. The shock rippled beyond pharmacies. Hospitals began rationing certain treatments. Clinics postponed non-essential procedures. Insurance companies quietly adjusted coverage to account for rising costs. Pharmacists, caught between desperate patients and dwindling inventories, worked double shifts trying to locate substitutes that often didn't exist. By autumn, the crisis had moved from an economic issue to a public health emergency. The very idea that a global superpower could run short of basic medication seemed unthinkable, yet it was happening in real time. Every delay in shipments, every spike in costs, revealed just how interdependent the world's medical system had become, and how quickly that balance could collapse when politics entered the equation. For years, trade policy had been discussed in terms of factories, steel, and jobs. Now, it was being measured in human lives and prescriptions left unfilled. The question was no longer about who won the trade dispute, but about who would bear the cost of it. As winter approached, that question lingered in pharmacies, hospitals, and homes across America, unanswered, and increasingly urgent. The timelines were grim. Even the most optimistic forecasts suggested it would take at least 6 months to stabilize medicine supplies, and that was only if India relaxed its restrictions. Nothing indicated it would. Instead, India was deepening ties with its BRICS partners: Brazil, Russia, China, and South Africa. From this alignment emerged what analysts began calling a medicine belt. It wasn't framed as punishment for the United States, but as a pivot toward nations eager to strengthen trade ties. For the first time in decades, America found itself at the back of the line for the world's most affordable and essential drugs. The irony was striking. For years, the United States had relied on Indian pharmaceutical factories to plug the holes in its overpriced healthcare system. Generics produced overseas kept insurance costs from spiraling, helped hospitals balance their budgets, and allowed families to afford their prescriptions. That dependence was convenient until it became a liability. As the flow of medicine slowed, the U.S. was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth: access to healthcare is not immune to politics. And when politics interferes, lives are placed on the line. The pressure spread quickly into the insurance sector. Providers facing soaring wholesale prices passed those costs directly to consumers. Families without comprehensive coverage were hit hardest, with critical prescriptions suddenly excluded from their plans altogether. The illusion of affordable care shattered, exposing a system built not on domestic resilience but on fragile international supply chains and diplomatic convenience. Perhaps the most dangerous shift was psychological. Generations of Americans had grown up believing their healthcare system, though expensive and imperfect, was fundamentally secure. That belief is eroding. A trade dispute thousands of miles away has revealed just how fragile the structure truly is. Medicine has joined oil and steel as another commodity vulnerable to geopolitical leverage, another bargaining chip in a world of shifting alliances. The statistic that once appeared as a simple figure in a trade report, 40% of America's generic drugs coming from India, now reads like a warning. Those generics are the foundation of the U.S. healthcare system, keeping hospitals stocked and families alive. The dependency had always existed, but this crisis stripped away the illusion of stability. What the nation is facing now isn't a temporary disruption. It is a full-scale stress test, and the system is failing in real time. Cracks are visible everywhere. In pharmacies unable to refill prescriptions, in hospitals rationing treatments, in insurance offices overwhelmed by claims, and in the homes of millions forced to make impossible choices. Amid this turmoil, another shockwave hit global markets. In an unprecedented joint move, India and China imposed a 100% tariff on iPhones, throwing Apple, the world's most valuable tech company, into its deepest crisis in over a decade. The scale of the move seemed almost surreal, yet it unfolded in plain sight. India, once hailed as Washington's dependable ally, had aligned with China, America's fiercest rival. Together, they delivered a coordinated blow aimed squarely at Apple, a company with billions tied up in factories, components, and millions of devices waiting to ship. The rupture could be traced back to late August 2025, when the Trump administration unveiled its sweeping 50% tariff on Indian imports, including electronics. For a nation long regarded as a partner, the measure carried a tone of hostility few could recall in modern U.S.-India relations. The White House defended it as retaliation for India's continued energy trade with Russia, calling it a matter of national security. But beyond the rhetoric, the economic consequences were far more tangled. At the center of the storm sat Apple, and with it, the broader American tech industry. To grasp the magnitude of the fallout, one must understand what India had become to Apple. In just a few years, the country evolved from a backup assembly site to the company's primary manufacturing base. By mid-2025, more than 7 out of every 10 iPhones sold in the United States were being assembled not in China, but in India. That shift, once celebrated as a diversification success story, had now become the company's greatest vulnerability. Between March and May alone, factories in India shipped $3.2 billion worth of iPhones, most headed straight for American consumers. It marked a stunning transformation. In just 1 year, India's iPhone exports surged 76%, while China's output plunged at nearly the same rate, a complete realignment of Apple's global supply chain. The shift reflected not only economic strategy but also political calculation. Industry reports showed India was already producing 14% of all iPhones worldwide, with Foxconn and other partners investing billions in new plants under generous government subsidies. The momentum was clear. India was positioning itself as a rising technology powerhouse. Then came Washington's tariff order, landing like a sledgehammer. What was meant as punishment for India's oil trade with Moscow instead struck directly at the core of Apple's carefully diversified production strategy. In the name of protecting national interests, the administration had destabilized one of the most vital supply chains in the U.S. economy. Trade, when used as a weapon, rarely hits its target cleanly, and this time, the collateral damage was enormous. Apple now stands at the center of the storm, its future tied to the escalating conflict. If iPhones assembled in India are forced to absorb the full 50% import tariff, costs will soar at an unprecedented rate. The company's